Good afternoon. It's nice to see you, Jim.
Glad to be with you.
Yeah, thank you. So, for our audience, this is Professor James Skillen, formerly of the Center for Public Justice in Washington, D.C., now retired and living in Birmingham, Alabama, where he is continuing to write and enjoy the extended family and sunshine of Alabama. Professor Skillen recently came out with a book called The Good of Politics, and I wanted to discuss that with him, so let's get right to it. Jim, what's good about politics?
Yeah, Bill, good question. It's pretty, I can imagine there aren't many people that believe much good about politics these days.
Yeah.
But what I'm after, what I think is there, is that the task of government to working with citizens to see that a public order, our republic, the word republic means public thing, our republic, is well ordered in such a way that justice is done to the various things that are in it. People, their families, schools, business enterprises, all of which need to be respected. Government doesn't create these things. Government doesn't create human nature. But there's an important role for government. Too many people think of government as a nuisance or as mainly problematic, but it seems to me that government, but not to think of it as the sole thing, government is with citizens. A polity, a republic, is something where a government governs citizens and government together. That's why representative government is so important. Work together to see that the public order is healthy. Now, whether it does that well, that's a different matter. It's like you can have good schooling or bad schooling. You can have healthy families and unhealthy families. You can have bad businesses and good businesses. But just like you'd say, family good, the good of family life, doesn't mean everything about present-day families is good. Not everything about contemporary politics is good, but the good of politics is to ask then, what is a good polity? What should a good republic look like?
The contemporary dialogue we have right now is a long way from the way in which you're parsing those issues. I mean, I hear none of that coming out of our political parties or the current administration. There seems to be no rootedness with respect to perspective and articulating vision forward. Why is that?
Yeah, it's a lot in our American tradition. The word republic, which we picked up and use, goes back in history. Res publica, that's the Latin for a public thing, presumed that there is such an order. It's different from family, it's different from churches, it's different from business enterprises, but it has a character and identity to itself. And therefore, we talk about somebody entering a public office. If you enter a public office, a judge, a representative, president, a governor, you are entering an office that has its own calling, its own task. It's not just what anybody wants to do, and it has an obligation to it. So it's kind of that's where the ought comes in. What ought a good government to do? You'd say, what ought a good judge to do, a just judge? But our tradition doesn't, of ideology, our tradition of perspective on government doesn't support that very well, because we believe that government is by the people, of the people, for the people. And going back to John Locke, we don't need to discuss John Locke, but he's the most important philosophical figure of the American Republic, basically taught that individuals are, first of all, free creatures. Government is not part of human nature. But because of foulness, St. Augustine would have said because of sin, because of the nature of the public order of people interacting with each other, I start stealing your sheep and you start stealing my apples, and pretty soon we're in conflict, and we want to find a way to solve the conflict. So you and I and others agree we should have an umpire. If we had an umpire that would then settle disputes, we could get on with our private lives. So government is really seen as something we create to protect life and property. It has a kind of private purpose, many private purposes. But if you go through that, and that's where we are, individuals, people that really want to emphasize individual freedom, those that want to emphasize more of kind of a common good, whatever the spectrum is, it all starts with individuals seeking to have a government protect them in their various private lives and properties. There's no room in that doctrine for what is the public order, what is a republic as such, what's the task of government. So The reason I don't talk much about that is our arguments over government is what should it do? And this company says, well, the government ought to do this. Farmers say government ought to do this. Family people say it should do this. So it's kind of a competition of interests to get government to aid what they want. But we don't really recognize that it has its own responsibility, its own task to make for a good republic. So we only get that by members of Congress, members of our legislatures, kind of brokering interests and seeing what's good for everybody as best they can. But inevitably, somebody wins, somebody loses, and we see that as the game of politics.
Are there traditions that don't approach politics that way?
Well, there's interest groups struggling everywhere, but there are democracies, there are other governmental accountability orders. I mean, where parliaments and courts and so forth help to hold accountable, where people do start with a greater sense of a commons, and that's what the public order ought to be. There are places where that's recognized more, and therefore, and it also has to do with the electoral system. I don't want to get into that now, but there are ways in which the electoral system can be structured. There are ways in which what people think about their life. I think one of the problems in America is that we just think that the good of anything comes back to my good. We're more individualist, we're more personalist. And it's pretty hard, even the most liberals of the United States are still asking whether they're asking about healthcare policy or welfare or environmental care. It's done in terms of this is what the public wants. This is what is good for individuals. This is how we can satisfy their need for freedom and autonomy. As long as you're doing that, then you're really playing off, well, I think we have more public support. You listen to politicians are quite often taken, the American people want. The American people want. Well, the American people isn't a single subject that has voiced their common will when they elect somebody. So that's trying to answer your question, why don't we have enough of that? I think that's not part of the mindset of the average American.
So if there's a significant skepticism today about public life, about public life and about governance, what's the good part? Why do you think we should think of the good of politics? What is the good of politics?
Well, I'm not, the way I'm looking at this is not so much look at that bad over there. We tend to see the bad, corrupt police officers, politician that took a bribe, when big business gets too much of the budget allocated to itself and somebody else doesn't get enough. That's the bad stuff. I'm not saying, well, amongst that there are some good things. But whether you talk about the good or the bad, come back to what criteria are we using to make the judgment. Why is it bad that the rich could get richer and the poor poorer? Maybe that's a good thing. Many people make the argument the richer the rich are, the more they're going to have to help the supply society, and the wealthier the society will become as a whole.
A trickle-down version of wealth.
Whatever, that could be one approach. But you have to have criteria of judgment. And what I'm trying to argue for is a criteria of judgment of what a good republic is not that we can add up more people are happier than the smaller number who are unhappy. It's that there is an ought. This is this norm. This is this criteria we should be able to use to say what is a just and healthy republic. So justice comes in there as a big factor. Public justice, a just polity. We often quite know it when it isn't there, in the sense that we will see, in fact, people become quite skeptical of government even being able to perform because, look, they're always feathering their own nest. Yeah, here's a guy, there's been a lot of it lately, this member of the cabinet of President Trump has spent too much on his own flights to do his business. Here's a guy that's taken too much for his own benefit. Those kinds of things highlight what we somehow sense that they shouldn't be doing that. They're there to serve the public. Well, agreed. So this idea of office, a public office, that has a whole history to it that goes back into the medieval period. Office means calling. It really goes back, and of course it comes from a time in which there was a sense God calls people to different tasks. And so being called to the office of a person who, without personal interest and without prejudgment, able to work for the common good. Now, for most people in a kind of secular society, office doesn't even have much to do with God. And in fact, we don't often talk much about office, but they fill an office and they should fill that for the public good. And then what our debate ought to be over is, what is that good of the public order? But if you don't even think that there's a public order that has a defined purpose to it, then people don't discuss that so much. They discuss, what do people want? What do the American citizens want?
Yeah, it's another version of polling, trying to kind of get our way
Yeah.
there. So, but isn't Locke right? I mean, isn't that where politics actually starts? How do you introduce norms and office into something that's a contractual environment that we've all entered into?
Well, you're asking a good question in the sense that we have had enough of a history, enough generations of people who have been taught this language of social contract. In other words, we as a society of people have contracted to agree that we should have a government of this kind. And that idea that, well, whether we were there or not, we're part of every time we vote, every time we keep living here and paying taxes, we're agreeing to be the autonomous, sovereign people. The people are sovereign.
For the people.
Who are affirming the government to do our will. But in fact, that whole idea is a myth. I mean, the idea that there was a social contract in the beginning. There was never any point in history where a bunch of autonomously free people gathered together and said, let's create a government. Governments have always been, they've been different kinds of governments. Our arguments and fights and wars have been over the end of the empire of the Egyptian pharaoh, the battles over the Roman Empire, the battles over this, and so forth. The battles have been, what kind of government do we find legitimate? And the arguments that most Americans are familiar with, if they are at all, go back to England, sovereign king and the different other overlords hold the king accountable. No, we're not going to pay you money to fight wars unless you do justice to us. We need a hearing. That's the origin of parliaments, etc. But in that sense, governments are always there. And the question is, what have we argued over about what they should and shouldn't do? And that gets at this normative question. It's still there today. We just don't think about it enough because we think most everything that it ought to do is in the Constitution. But a constitution is something that people created at the time to try to articulate their vision. And those should always be amended as we see the need for it, as we amended the Constitution after the Civil War to say, yeah, black people are real people. They're not just property. So when injustice shows its face, it may require just better government, better laws. It may require a constitutional revision.
So I take it you take exception with John Locke. It seems to me Locke's notion of being human is at stake in his very claim. Granted that he couldn't justify his claim about social contract historically. Isn't he fundamentally right about the nature of being human? Aren't we, at the end of the day, autonomous individuals making our own choices?
I too take great umbrage at Locke. I mean, I think he's wrong about that. It was part of the modern wave that came in. He was kind of still in the, it wasn't the Middle Ages. He was in the kind of period of Reformation. He was a Protestant, a liberal Protestant. He didn't think he was changing that. It was in the battles over England. And he was trying to get at this whole question of how can a government be adequately representative of the people. And since the very nature of the battles in which they were fighting that time, they seemed to be a wars of religion. They're called that, the religious wars of the 17th century that fed into the 18th century. It looked like, well, there's no religious basis for common ground because we just got Protestants and Catholics and everybody fighting with each other. The fight was still about whose church ought to be ahead of the government, whose church ought to be calling the moral shots. And Locke was trying to get away with that and find another ground. And he wanted to get back to individuals and their own autonomous beliefs, their freedom of conscience, you could say. And it's out of that that we're going to have to get a basis for a common government. I think, excuse me, I think there's a better way to do it. Although, let me make a connection between Locke and Augustine, the 4th century, 300, early 400s church father, who was the more important founding father of the Christian church of all wings. Because Augustine made a similar argument, but there's a difference with Locke. Augustine argued humans are not by nature political creatures. His argument is God ordained government because of sin, and therefore the government is there to restrain sinners and punish evildoers. And I disagree with Locke on that in this sense that indeed government does have, as far as we know historically, I would argue today, it does have a retributive justice function to restrain injustice and to punish evildoers. The debates there are over what evildoing should government punish as compared with parents punishing their kids for not doing their homework, or a business firing somebody for malfeasance or something. What kind should government do? So that kind of argument is important. But if you look even at Augustine's time, but especially in our time, what do governments spend most of their time doing? Well, it does depend whether it's the federal government or a state government or a local government or a county government. But most of what they're doing is not retributive at all. It's deciding to have a good sewage system so we keep a healthy society, how to have water system distribution, how to encourage schooling, how to have courts where people can go to in disagreement over the contracts they do form privately. It's doing all kinds of things that are publicly beneficial. It's generally called distributive justice, how to see to it that what we share in common is adequately distributed for the public. So, in fact, then you say, well, the argument for retributive justice isn't what creates the need for distributive justice. I would say it's the other way around. It's because a government primarily is there to be a public administrator. You can call it administrative good, to administrate what the common shares for the good of all. It's when that should be, and what happens is people, by violating that trust, stealing what's good, not obeying the good patterns, going through stoplights on these highways, putting their sewage in the wrong places instead of the sewage system. When there are these kinds of civil or criminal laws, there needs to be retribution. Some of it's just a penalty by fine. It's not always locking up or anything, but retributive justice. But what do you have retributive justice for? Just so you can say, hey, we finally got that guy in prison? No, you punish evildoer to make sure that the good of the public order is upheld, that it can be restored, that people can have confidence that they can live with their neighbors in a public order of good. So it's in that sense that I think Augustine was missing what I would call the true meaning of creatureliness, that God made us as creatures who not only could farm fields and have families and make music and educate their children and build bridges. I mean, all these things have gradually emerged over history. We not only have those capabilities, but we need to manage all of that in a public way. There are things that just people coming and going with all their different capabilities and building all the things they do doesn't make automatically for a good public order. That needs to be managed. So I think we are by nature creatures made for political life, made for public order life. And therefore, my view of human nature, which is much more communal in that sense, highly diversified communal, it's not just one community, family communities and church communities, business communities, were made for all kinds of different ways. We are communal creatures. There is never been an individual who just walked forth in their autonomy. There's no child that ever raised itself. When children come to maturity such that they can become decision-making persons, it's decision-making persons in the context of their continuing to be family members, being now employees in a business, citizens in a society. So it's those people who have real responsibility. I don't want to take away from the importance of the individual person's responsibility, but they bear responsibility always in different kinds of contexts, for the friend they have, with the family they have, with the businesses they have, etc. And that's where I think we are by nature made for political communities to do justice.
Let's stick with the contemporary ethos we inhabit right now. It seems to me there's a continuing to be sort of moving from Locke, but to the moment, a strong what I would call libertarian ethos we inhabit, which would fundamentally deny your claim about the distributive aspect of government being a good thing. That though all of those, I've heard various arguments, but in some sense, all of those functions should be left to the marketplace, or a version of that. What's your take on that?
Well, it's not unlike some people saying if all parents were just responsible, kids would grow up and they'd be responsible, and we wouldn't have the need for police officers. We wouldn't have the need for
Right.
that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Some would say, well, that's kind of hard to imagine, but isn't it true that it's in the marketplace that people can make most of the decisions they need for their own lives? It's in the marketplace you can decide whether to buy a violin or a trombone if you want to get into music. It's in the marketplace that I decide freely that I want to go to this school or that school, this college or that school. And shouldn't everything be open simply to that decision making? Well, even if you say yes as a starting point, and I don't, then you come back to saying, well, who's going to decide when that's been properly done? What about cheating in the marketplace? What about monopolies? So one company, the dominant company in a town, gains control basically over the economy. Well, it's still market, but there's only one market. There's only one dominant company. Well, no, you ought to restrain monopolies. And what about contracts? They're signed. You sign up. You agree to work for this company, but they cheat you. Well, what do? Well, go to the marketplace, simply leave that job and go to another one. From history, but also just from logic, you can begin to see what's necessary for a market to function properly are laws for the market. What can and can't a market do? I mean, why can't a market employ 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds to do certain things? What about slaves? What about this? Well, pretty soon what we begin to say is, well, no, a healthy market is going to require no monopolies, no slavery, no child labor, no complete environmental destruction, so you can't breathe or drink clean water. Those are the things that over time have gradually, and so free markets have actually emerged in public legal orders. You don't get very free markets in places where there isn't good public law. Now, government shouldn't be manipulating all the decisions that buyers and sellers make. That's true, and therefore there has to be market freedom. But market freedom is a little bit like saying individual freedom. You should be free as an individual, but not to shoot whoever you want, not to stand up in a crowded theater and yell fire just for the fun of it. And there are lots of things that you can do in a personal way, but not in this and this and this way that causes destruction. So it's in that sense that I think maximizing human freedom is really protecting the varieties of kinds of responsibilities people freely want to exercise. And my being a school teacher and you being a bridge builder and somebody else being a doctor in a medical center, those are different kind of vocations for us each to be able to choose and operate them. There needs to be a public order that will protect that. And that also means protect the market.
So whether you're a libertarian or from another tradition, it seems to me you're making clear assumptions about the nature of being human, the nature of the public order, and so on. You're asserting all kinds of things in your policies that derive out of these other premises.
Oh, precisely.
Yeah.
Precisely. And to get at some of this, you really need to do some history, because part of where we are is because of historical development. It didn't just fall. I mean, the what we think about human nature, people disagree about what they think they are. I'm convinced, for example, that humans are created in the image of God. I think the dignity of the human person derives from how they were created. Other people say there's no God. I wasn't created by anybody. I don't believe that. Well, then what do you see as why should you be respected for your dignity? Why should I have respect for your dignity when in fact my own dignity calls for me to control you or something like that? If people have different fundamental views of human nature, it will affect everything. Not only their view of what they think they want to get out of life, the way they raise their children. If I'm a socialist and a believing socialist, I'm going to raise my children to think in a and see life through socialist lenses. If I'm a Muslim, if I'm a Christian. But at the same time, those fundamental views don't completely change the structure of reality.
You're still a parent.
We're still humans. There are certain things you don't get rid of just by willfulness. You don't get rid of human nature in all of its different dimensions. You don't get rid of all the things that human beings are creating. I mean, I might want to fly like a bird, but I can't make myself out of my autonomy. I can't make myself a bird.
Yeah.
Can't make myself a bear. So there are these identifying characteristics, and they aren't just physical characteristics. They have to do with things that humans do that no other creature does. So that has to be explained, or you make assumptions about. And of course, if the debate in politics or elsewhere comes back to fundamental assumptions, then you can't pretend they don't exist. There are some people say, look, leave your religion at the door and come in and let's all just think rationally in a common way. Well, it'd be only like if religion is take my coat off when I come into a warm room. But it's not something that functions that way. Religion, or I call religiously equivalent convictions, that is the fundamental way I look at life. I may not think they're religious. Maybe I'm a diehard socialist or a diehard libertarian or diehard something, and that's the fundamental basis that won't change. Well, that's being held then the way religious people believe in the roots of their assumptions. And those things will control everything. They will give color everything, let's put it that way.
So to twist it, we're all religious.
Everybody has, yes, I would say, but then you have to get at what is meant by religion.
Yeah.
What most people mean by religion today is either something related to church-like activities, church, temple, mosque, or they mean something like the cultic practices that people do with their religions. That is, they worship on Sunday or Saturday, they say prayers to God, they try to tell others about God, they sing songs of praise to God, they plead with God. Well, those are kinds of activities. But from my point of view, and there are others that agree not from my point of view, but for the same reasons, human beings act according to what they believe in all that they do. I don't just praise God in believing in God. I raise my children with a view that they're God's creatures. I teach as if learning matters because you and I are learning creatures. And I want to encourage your learning to be healthy and sound. It has nothing to do with trying to, people who are trying just to force people to believe in certain things if I'm in a classroom. That's not education. That's mind-numbing. Mm-hmm. So even there, it will be in many socialist-minded places. They just teach you what Mao said or what Marx said. You believe it. This is what we're going to do. Learn to memorize it, to do it. That kind of rote memory or mind-numbing from a childhood on, I would say, is not true education from my point of view, given who human beings are.
Mm-hmm. So let me cast it one other way, then I want to come back to Locke in a way.
Yeah.
So basically, everybody has a deep set of convictions about reality. You can't operate without that. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. But again, don't start, it's true, we each do, but keep in mind, no individuals do this by themselves.
Right.
Today, many people are pretending, well, I have my own religion.
I'm spiritual.
Created it yesterday, yeah. It doesn't last, it won't work by and large. What we have now is
Why won't it work?
Well, as soon as that individual's gone, their religion's gone. Unless, of course, they shared it with their children and taught them and had a school to teach them, which is a communal activity again. And those people have to believe, too, and want to make it keep going. You'll find many of these smaller cultic religions, they come and they last a few generations or one person's lifetime. But whether or not, my point would be that most of the deepest religions or equivalent religions that have lasted a long time or have lasted longer than most others. Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, and then Hinduism, there are a variety like that, traditional religions. Mm-hmm. But you look at the modern world of deep faith in science and technology as the means of bringing freedom to control nature. I'd say that's a kind of faith in science and technology. It's a way for many people in the origin, it meant getting rid of getting out of the way these nasty religious convictions, which only confuse us getting true knowledge. That was a deep faith. And it's still very much a part of shaping our modern culture. For many people, science is something you want to get to truth about where we're going to go. And religion, it should be put to the sidelines or gotten out of the way. I would say many of the political ideologies, nationalism, which is, I think, the strongest political determinant of many, many countries, socialism, and in various forms, and liberalism in the sense of the autonomy of the individual. I think all of those go together with what I would call modern modernity, modern faith in human autonomy. But those political ideologies last a long time, and they last as long as there are cultures that carry them. So they may come and go. Postmodernism of our day, in many ways, is calling into question this whole modern belief that there's a narrative of progress, that we're going to get somewhere by believing in science and technology and human autonomy, and eventually the world's going to get better and better. Many people still have that belief. Many people are saying, yeah, I don't think so.
On that belief, I never figured out where they were trying to get.
Well,
what's the end game?
Complete freedom for humans, no more dangers to health and society, no more threats from enemies, but more and more knowledge, end of diseases, anything that's seen as a limit to human beings or a frustration or a nuisance, we're going to get rid of it because that's what we know we want. Mm-hmm. Well, so I think that's many people would say, well, that's not religion, that's just modern thought.
Yeah.
Well, modern thought that's concentrated on getting rid of or putting to the side other religions. That's like, Christianity isn't a deformed religion, it's just trying to get rid of atheism. Well, yeah, if it is, it's because it believes something else very deeply.
Let me read just a sentence or two from your book, The Good of Politics, on page 107.
Oh, now we're in trouble.
Yeah. It's having to do with that notion of the Enlightenment, that period of John Locke and several other primary thinkers for our time. So this is not something a lot of us talk about on a day-to-day basis, but it does seem to be the air we breathe. So here's what you said. The Enlightenment gave expression to a culture-wide, religiously deep way of life oriented toward reshaping the world, liberating human beings from every kind of bondage in order to achieve what no philosophy or religion of the past had done. The spirit of the Enlightenment and Romantic era humanism is still very much at work today, and not only in the West. And it is a strong, if not stronger, a stronger force in the world now more than Christianity or Islam.
Well, I think in many ways now Christianity is the largest, has the largest number of adherents. Islam is next, I think. So those religions are very strong and prevalent. But neither has a monopoly on anything. Well, there are countries in which Sharia law or something has strong control, and Christianity is dominant in certain countries, lesser and less being dominant over the whole society. And I would say to understand the Enlightenment, the quote you just gave, one has to understand where it came from. The Enlightenment didn't pop out of nowhere. It came out of rebellion against the Christianity of the medieval West. And there was the control of the church of society, the people who owned the properties, the people under the monarchs and the church. And people, as they were coming into a greater degree of antagonism toward that and freedom from it, wanted that burden lifted off. The cry of the French Revolution was neither God nor master. If we get rid of God and master, then we're going to achieve freedom. Now, what's curious about that is that whole idea of freedom had its roots in Christianity, the Christian West. Not pure Christianity, but the Christian Western tradition. And that's the only thing like it that's in the world. The Enlightenment ideal couldn't have arisen out of Buddhism, out of Islam, as it was structured at the time. It came out of the West. In that sense, it became a dominant cultural vision. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is if you go to any country in the world today where they're working at educating, improving an economy, getting it greater, many of the norms and standards that will now structure larger elements of their public life, of their economic development ideals, come from the West. Mm-hmm. So they are not completely dominant in some parts of the world, let's say China or India, where ancient religions in India and a very strong capitalist socialist version under a strong government are there. There is a master in China. There are gods in India. But I would say that the secular modern idea of what science, technology, economic development should do coming out of the West is universal, very prevalent in a way that many things aren't. And they shape culture more. So in that sense, I think that's true where it comes from. But also if you look at the modern Enlightenment ideal, and I'm not the only one to point out, I get this from others. If you look at it, in many ways it's a deformation or a secularization of Christianity. What's it trying to do? It's trying to deal with evil. What's the evil, the sin that needs to be overcome by salvation? It's ignorance. It's priests putting down all these myths, forcing them on you so that you're believing nonsense. That's from their point of view. If we're liberated from that, well, what's the Savior? Who's the Savior? Well, it's not Jesus Christ. It's true knowledge, true scientific knowledge. So who's the origin of this? Well, individuals who were entrapped that are now being set free from entrapment to think their own thoughts, to do true science, and to not be bound by masters. Going toward what? Well, not heaven or new heavens and new earth of biblical Christianity, but toward an earth made new, bringing heaven down to earth. In many ways, what they're after is a kind of secularization of what Christianity. In sin, we are in a perplexity. We look forward to eternal life. Overcoming it requires salvation towards something. That's whole idea of a progressive trajectory. It still has very much structure of a Christian teaching. That gave it its shape and its moral power, I would say.
But I hear your point historically, but theologically, surely heaven doesn't come down to earth.
Yeah.
In the Christian narrative, does it?
Well, if you see the degree to which Gnosticism influenced Christianity, and it's still there, ancient Gnosticism, which influenced the early church, it was declared a heresy in early church councils. But Gnosticism had this idea that we are trapped, our bodies. This is kind of a bad world. It's the negative world. And it's a world in which the God of the Old Testament is bringing down judgment upon people. But what we need, said the Gnostics, is liberation through true knowledge. That's what the word gnosis means from Gnostic. We need the true, and it was even seen as secret knowledge that would allow us to see that in our souls we can be liberated from our bodies, either in reality now by the way we come to a true knowledge of an insight of that which is beyond. Someone called it getting back to our true home. Before our souls ended up in this dark world, these bodies, they were free, and we're going to be liberated to go home again. And for many Christians, they interpreted Christianity that way. Christ is the one who comes from the true home of God above. He's the true good God who comes to bring life, bring it eternal to people, so that our souls can escape to go to heaven and leave our bodies behind. So the whole idea that souls live after death, that's not Christian. That's Gnostic. The idea that there's something basically corrupt about the material world or our bodies is not Christian. All of us are corrupted by sin from a Christian point of view. It's not the body that's the problem. Bodies are okay. God made us to be whole creatures with bodies. And the vision of Christianity of the future is new bodies. In other words, it's a whole life of human beings on earth. We pray the Lord's Prayer, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Revelation.
Isn't that in the future?
Well, it could be that until the resurrection occurs, it's future in many ways. But we begin to have a foretaste of that, says Paul. And in the book of Revelations, the picture of the New Jerusalem is of a bride coming down fit for her husband and it's a new earth. So it's not heaven above beyond this reality that we're escaping to. It's remade creation. It's fulfilled creation. And that does involve resurrection. There's a whole Christian teaching. I'm just saying relative to Enlightenment mythology, which is very much an influence in our culture. Mm-hmm. I'm also saying from a Christian point of view, the development of science and technology, development of business, the development of music and the arts, this is all good stuff. This is what it means to be human. Mm-hmm. But what you believe about the meaning of those, no Christian should believe that science and technology are going to save us. Christian should believe that the meaning of science or technology functions like a savior. It's a human responsibility. It's not our savior. And we can corrupt science and technology, as we've frequently done, as easily as we can corrupt something else in our sinful intentions.
Yeah. Let's stick with this just a minute. I know we've been on it for a bit, but I think this whole influence of the Enlightenment and this notion of being autonomous individuals whose task and vision is to be free is a big deal. At least it is in the conversations I have. So I'm interested if you would comment a bit more about what I'll call the freedom motif in Western culture. I mean, so much of our political discussion, and your book is The Good of Politics, so much of our political discussion seems to be loaded with this question of how we do or don't make people more free. And yet we're a country that practiced slavery officially for a long time. How does this work?
Well, let me try that in conclusion.
Yeah.
We're coming to our conclusion and wrap it up with what I see as the confusion of our day, okay. The sense of disorientation people have, the loss of a center of gravity, in many people a loss of hope, not knowing where we're going. How could this Enlightenment view lead us to the point where we actually think in those kinds of terms? And I would say that part of what allowed the Enlightenment to function for a long time, and even into early American culture, was that the moral base of that, what was still taken for granted by many people in moral terms, was not the complete autonomy of individuals, though they wanted freedom. It was all kinds of Christian moral criteria left over about how to treat one another, how to respect the government and different authorities, to change it, of course, but to certain mores that were there. And for many people, it shaped it. And even slavery came about because most people believed, when it was done in early America, that this is a good thing. So it's when those things that we think are good that aren't so good begin to be challenged and looked at, then you're after this question of what's good, what's the ought about how we ought to shape life, what's a good law compared to a bad one. But the more you go with the freedom ideal, the first thing that happened is people began to see, and it's quite evident today to postmodernists, the further science goes, the further it shows that you aren't free at all. You're just a product of your genes. You're a product of the chemical, physical things that made you. So on the one hand, people believe in science and technology. Most of us take it for granted, not necessarily as a deep faith, but it's goodness, as a means to ever improvement, or at least as the truth by which we will judge other truths. But in fact, if we really took it seriously, we'd say, we're all helpless creatures. There's no hope for any freedom. I do what I do because my genes make me do it. Now, on the other hand, as that came to be clear in the development of modern science, there became this reaction that said, no, there's a freedom to humanity that is not determined by our bodies and our scientific functions.
Right.
That set in motion all of these efforts against any kind of establishment, because we're not going to have anybody, including scientists, tell me what I want to do. The further that goes, each of us is deciding on our own what I'm going to judge to be true and right. Well, you just try to judge what is true and right, always against all others, and create your own criteria. You can't live in a society where every individual has their own criteria. So that's why there are groupies. That's why people, what their peers do and say has a big influence on them, not just when they're young. It has to do with dress. It has to do with all kinds of things that we do that we decide become good for the society. So in one sense, we are products of a society. The difference is that human beings can change. They can assume the responsibility to change, make new laws through parliaments, start a new business, make changes in a business, change a curriculum at schools, change family patterns. We don't do exactly what my parents did. But there has to be some confidence that this is the good thing to do, that enough people. Our problem today is that most everybody questions everything. What institution is stable any longer? Churches are no longer just automatically trusted. There's sexual molestation in churches. The media, what about the media?
Fake
well,
news.
Fox News is nonsense. CNN, they're trustworthy. The other way around. You get newspapers, cable channels. You get everything can fly. But what are you going to do with the future of your life when you're in college? Well, I was going to go this way, but those companies don't exist anymore.
Right.
I was going to work for this bank, but it's been bought out by this bank. Nothing's stable. So the idea of me individually orienting my life to what I want to be free to do, you'll find that you can't do that. Your freedom to choose a job is going to depend on who's offering jobs. Your freedom to vote for somebody is going to decide on whether those kind of people are running for office. So it pushes us right back to what I would say we have to take human communal identity, our responsibility to act together when it comes to institutional and communal actions. But that's what we don't have grounding for. I think that's being undermined, and we don't have a common basis. Enlightenment ideology, Christianity, secularism, liberalism, nationalism, we all disagree. We all love the nation, but we disagree over what it ought to be. I think that's the plight. And I think genuine Christianity has something to say to that, but not make-believe religion.